Ethan woke up to the sound of heavy machinery growling outside his window. His heart slammed against his ribs as he threw off the covers, scrambling to his feet. Something was wrong. His sleepy mind struggled to process what was happening, but as soon as he yanked open the blinds, his blood ran cold. There, at the edge of his property, a massive yellow excavator sat idling, its engine rumbling like a hungry beast ready to devour. A group of men in neon vests stood near the curb, one of them holding a clipboard, another stretching caution tape across his driveway. Ethan's stomach churned as panic clawed at his throat. He barely had time to grab his phone before he heard the loudspeakers blaring from the truck parked nearby. By order of the homeowner association, this property is scheduled for demolition due to non-compliance with community standards. Ethan's brain short-circuited for a second. Demolition? What community standards? He didn't even belong to their stupid HOA. He yanked open the door and stormed outside, barefoot, adrenaline flooding his veins. "Hey," he bellowed, waving his arms. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man with the clipboard barely glanced up before returning to his notes. "Sir, please stand back. This is an authorized operation." Ethan gawked at him. Authorized by who? He already knew the answer. His heart pounded as his gaze flicked across the street, and sure enough, there she was, Linda, the HOA president, standing on her front porch, arms crossed, watching with the smug satisfaction of a queen overseeing a peasant's punishment. His hands curled into fists as white-hot rage pulsed through him. He had expected the HOA's usual petty antics, passive-aggressive letters, ridiculous fines, maybe another fake warning about his trash bins being unsightly. But this was a declaration of war. It had started months ago when Ethan, a software engineer tired of the city's relentless noise and congestion, finally found his dream retreat, a quaint vacation home nestled at the edge of a quiet, tree-lined community. The place was perfect, private, peaceful, and most importantly, not under the rule of an HOA. He had made sure of that before buying the property, double-checking the boundaries and confirming with the seller, an old-timer named Carl, who had gleefully told him, "I built this house outside their grip on purpose. Best decision I ever made." That was all Ethan needed to hear. He signed the papers, packed his weekend bags, and for the first time in years, he had a slice of paradise to escape to. Life was good. The first few weeks were everything he had dreamed of. No sirens, no honking horns, no screaming neighbors. Just the chirping of birds, the rustling of trees, and the occasional deer wandering through his backyard. He spent his evenings on the deck with a beer, watching the sunset, convinced he had found his own little corner of heaven. Then one day, a letter arrived. It came in a crisp white envelope with an official-looking seal. Ethan had opened it absent-mindedly, expecting some junk mail or maybe a friendly note from a neighbor. Instead, he found a warm but firm invitation from the homeowner association, welcoming him to the community and encouraging him to join their ranks. The letter was filled with nauseatingly cheerful phrases about maintaining neighborhood harmony and ensuring property values remained at their highest. But the real kicker was the closing line. "Someone from our board will be reaching out soon to discuss your membership and next steps." Ethan had frowned, reading it twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. There was no next step. He wasn't part of the HOA. His house wasn't even within their jurisdiction. It had to be a mistake. He tossed the letter aside and thought nothing of it. A week later, another letter came. This one wasn't as friendly. It reminded him that community participation was highly encouraged and strongly recommended, that he consider signing up before any conflicts arose. Conflicts? Ethan scoffed, tossing the letter into the trash. It was starting to feel more like a threat than an invitation. Then came the notices. First, it was a warning about his lawn not meeting community aesthetic standards. He received a fine for having his trash bins visible from the street. Then there was a letter claiming his house's paint color was not in line with neighborhood expectations. Each one was more absurd than the last. Ethan knew exactly what was happening. They were trying to force his hand, wearing him down with constant harassment until he gave in. But he wasn't the kind of guy who caved under pressure. He had no intention of joining their HOA, and he wasn't about to start paying ridiculous fees for rules that didn't even apply to him. He called a lawyer just to be safe and was reassured that legally, he was in the clear. The HOA had no authority over him. Confident in that knowledge, he wrote a polite but firm letter declining their offer, making it crystal clear that he was not and never would be part of their association. That's when things got ugly. The next day, he found a bright orange sign staked into his yard. This property does not comply with HOA standards. Then came the anonymous complaint letters, allegedly from concerned neighbors who didn't appreciate his lack of community spirit. He started finding odd things around his property: dead leaves and branches dumped onto his driveway, trash mysteriously appearing overnight, his mailbox slightly bent out of shape. One morning, he discovered someone had spray-painted "Join or Leave" on his fence. The HOA denied any involvement, of course. Must have been some local kids, Linda had said, her smile just a little too pleased. Ethan installed security cameras, but the harassment continued, always just subtle enough to avoid clear evidence of who was behind it. It was a mind game, and they were playing dirty. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to waking up to the sound of demolition equipment outside his house. Ethan's mind snapped back to the present as he stood in his driveway, heart hammering, fists clenched. The workers were still there, waiting for the go-ahead, and Linda was still watching, waiting for him to break. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "If any of you so much as touch my house, I will have every single one of you arrested for trespassing and destruction of property." The clipboard guy hesitated, his pen hovering over the paper. Ethan pulled out his phone and started recording. "Let's get one thing straight. I am not part of your HOA. You have no authority over me. So unless you want to explain to the cops why you're illegally demolishing private property, I suggest you pack up and leave." There was a long, tense silence. Then the clipboard guy turned to his crew and gave a half-hearted shrug. "Stand down," he muttered. The workers exchanged uncertain glances, then started backing away, shutting off their equipment. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders loosen just a fraction. He had won this round. But as he turned back toward his house, he saw Linda still standing there, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she smirked, turned on her heel, and walked away. Ethan had no idea what she was planning next, but he knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. Ethan thought the worst was over after stopping the demolition crew, but he should have known better. The HOA wasn't just going to walk away after being humiliated like that. The moment Linda smirked and turned away, he felt it in his gut. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something worse. The next day, he found another notice taped to his door, this one even more aggressive than before. It claimed his property had been flagged as a persistent community concern, and that he had exactly 1 week to resolve the outstanding violations or face further action. Further action? He scoffed at the wording, tossing the paper onto his kitchen counter. What were they going to do? Find him again? Send another crew? He had already made it clear they had no legal authority over his property. His lawyer had reassured him time and time again that the HOA couldn't enforce their rules on a house that wasn't within their jurisdiction. But logic didn't seem to apply to Linda and her band of power-hungry enforcers. Ethan barely had time to process the latest harassment before the final blow came crashing down on him like a wrecking ball, literally. It started with an early morning wake-up call, not from his alarm clock, but from the deafening roar of engines outside his house. His body jolted upright as he rubbed his eyes, his mind struggling to catch up with the sudden noise. The walls of his bedroom vibrated as the sound grew louder, heavier, like a stampede of mechanical beasts rolling down his peaceful street. Panic shot through him as he leapt out of bed, grabbing his phone before rushing to the window. What he saw sent ice through his veins. A massive bulldozer was pulling up in front of his house, accompanied by a fleet of construction trucks. A demolition crew was already stepping out, stretching, adjusting their hard hats, getting ready for something. His something. His house. Ethan's stomach twisted into a knot so tight it hurt. His feet barely touched the floor as he sprinted to the front door, throwing it open with enough force to nearly rip it off its hinges. "Hey, stop," he shouted, his voice cracking from both the early morning grogginess and the sheer disbelief of what was happening. One of the workers, a tall man holding a clipboard, barely glanced at him before muttering, "Sir, please step aside. We have orders to proceed." Orders? Ethan's breath came in short bursts as he tried to process the words, his pulse pounding so hard in his ears he could barely think. Orders? From who? His eyes darted across the street, and sure enough, standing there like a villain watching her plan unfold, was Linda. arms crossed, head slightly tilted, an expression so infuriatingly smug it made Ethan's hands curl into fists. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Ethan turned back to the clipboard guy, shoving past the crew as they began unloading their tools. "Orders from who?" he snapped. "Because I sure as hell didn't sign off on this." The man flipped through his papers lazily, barely registering Ethan's outrage. "This demolition has been authorized due to safety concerns, according to the HOA. "I'm not in the HOA." Ethan roared, his voice so sharp and full of rage that even a few of the workers hesitated mid-step. His chest heaved as he pointed a trembling finger at Linda. "This is illegal. You have no right to be here. If you touch so much as a single brick of my house, I will have every last one of you arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property." For the first time, the clipboard guy actually looked at him. He let out a slow breath, shifting uncomfortably, and that's when Ethan saw it, that tiny flicker of doubt in his eyes. The HOA might have fed them some nonsense about an official order, but they hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected a homeowner standing in his doorway in nothing but sweatpants, ready to go to war to protect what was his. Ethan wasted no time. His phone was already in his hand, and before Linda could slither her way over with more lies, he was dialing 911. The police arrived before Linda could make her grand entrance. Two officers stepped out of their cruiser, hands resting on their belts, scanning the situation. Ethan wasted no time running up to them, shoving every document he had into their hands. "This is my house," he said, breathless but determined. "The HOA has no jurisdiction here. They've been harassing me for months, fabricating violations, and now they're trying to demolish my home without any legal authority." The officers took one look at the paperwork and immediately turned to Linda. "Ma'am, do you have legal documentation proving this demolition is authorized?" Linda hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she handed over her own stack of papers. Ethan watched closely as the officer flipped through them, his expression shifting from neutral to something much less patient. Then he sighed, shaking his head. "This isn't legally enforceable," he said firmly. "The HOA has no right to carry out a demolition on private property without a court order. This is trespassing at best, destruction of property at worst." Linda's face darkened, her grip on her coffee mug tightening. "Officer, I think you're misunderstanding." "No," Ethan snapped, cutting her off. "You're misunderstanding. Your little reign of terror? It ends today." The officers turned to the demolition crew. "Pack it up. This job is canceled." Just like that, the workers started gathering their equipment, exchanging awkward glances as they loaded everything back onto their truck. The clipboard guy mumbled an apology before trudging off, clearly eager to be done with this disaster. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was far from over. Linda wasn't going to let this go, not without one last dig. "You think this is over?" she murmured, low enough so only Ethan could hear. "You may have won today, but I promise you, I always get what I want." Ethan smiled, a slow, victorious smile that made her stiffen. "Not this time," he said. "And not ever again." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal battles and media coverage. Ethan's lawyer wasted no time filing a lawsuit against the HOA, citing harassment, emotional distress, and attempted destruction of private property. The local news ate the story up, turning Linda into a public villain overnight. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before finally came forward, sharing their own horror stories about her oppressive rule. Under pressure and facing mounting legal fees, Linda finally resigned as HOA president. The lawsuit settled in Ethan's favor, awarding him a hefty sum in damages. But more than that, he had his home, his peace, his freedom. As he sat on his deck weeks later, watching the sunset with a beer in hand, he let out a long, satisfied sigh. The battle had been brutal, exhausting, and at times infuriating. But in the end, he had won. Damn, it felt good. Ethan's victory wasn't just personal, it became a symbol of resistance against overreaching HOAs across the country. His story inspired others to stand up against similar injustices, and slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. As for Linda, she faded into obscurity, her once iron grip on the community now a distant memory. Ethan, on the other hand, found a new sense of purpose. He became an advocate for homeowners' rights, using his experience to help others navigate the murky waters of HOA disputes. And as he sat on his deck, Watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. He had fought for his freedom, and he had won. And that was worth every battle.